I'm John Casellas Connors. I'm an assistant professor in geography here at Texas A&M, and I have the privilege of introducing these wonderful talks today. I'll keep my introductions quite brief because we're starting a little bit late, but this session will focus on pandemics, ecology, and well-being. And our first speaker is going to be Dr. Rose Jolly. She is the Vice Chair of Humanities and Literature at Pennsylvania State University. And there she works across departments of comparative literature, English, and bioethics. And she also coordinates with the Health Humanities Department at Penn State College of Medicine. Her work is at the nexus of health humanities, global health, and prevention care continuums. And her research addresses the ways that representations of violence and reconciliation shape social relations in the context of conflict. She notably became the first humanist to be selected as a principal investigator on a Canadian Institute of Health's research grant. And her third and forthcoming monograph on the way is entitled The Effluent Eye, Narrative, Health, and Decolonial Right-Making in the Wake of Human Rights. Today she's going to be offering a presentation, Decolonizing Man, Resituating Pandemic and Intervention in the Pathogenesis of Colonial Capitalism. So please join me in welcoming Rose Jolly.
All right, so those of you who ever did like Postcolonial 101 will recognize this slide instantly. This is me claiming that the very constitution of man, in the way we understand man in the modern world today, and this speaks to a lot of our panels earlier, it's the basics of that critique, I think, going back to basics, is based on Manichaean allegory. And Manichaean allegory is the notion that man is of God, clean, white, sacred, intelligent, human, mind, written word, male and subordinate, female and heterosexist matrix, and that the other side is all of those other things. And I'm very familiar with this way of thinking in embodied practice because I was born in apartheid South Africa, and I have a birth certificate that says that I am born into the white race and carry all the privileges and responsibilities attached to that state or that classification. So I'm just want to make sure that everybody understands, and that's why it's in pink, bright pink, that this is a fantasy of the colonizer. This is not an actuality. Okay. However, a lot of this is going to be going on to talk about the fact that people in power can make their fantasies actual, which is a real problem. So just to make it clear, what I mean is that if you had come to my town where I grew up for part of my time, we were chased all over the country by the government, but in one town in Bloemfontein, a predominantly white Afrikaner town, if you had seen black people there, you would have seen people that were in the early 1970s that were illiterate, very spoken literate, but that wasn't recognized. Illiterate and very poor and dirty and all of those other things would have appeared, not were, all of the things on the negative side of the allegory, and that is because the apartheid government deprived them of education, housing, access to water, etc. And this is what I mean by folks in power have the ability, colonizers and such like, and I'll nuance that as I go in terms of what I mean by that, have the power to impose their fantasies on and make actuality appear concordant with their fantasies. So these qualities are not universally held, obviously. They're based on the Western notion of the human, which we were discussing the genesis of this morning, right? They manifest an inherent bias, which positions everyone and everything not embodied in the notion of Western man. Man, capital M, is what I'm calling that fantasy of the man. Good? We're good to go? Okay. Outside of the ambit of respect. Quality in the context of the human, of human rights, and this is part of my argument of the book, and I'm not going to touch too much on human rights because I don't have that much time. It refers not simply to characteristics, but also a sense of superior quality. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about it much now, but just to say that my book argues that the man of human rights is the man of Western man, which is why human rights don't work, okay, for most people. They only work for the exception. Okay, this human doesn't represent the human. He is considered to be the human, all right? And he is considered to be universally desirable. Not for me, but within this fantasy. Okay, the values that inhere in human rights are historically, contextually a core part of colonial narratives, right, which emerge in contemporary life in capitalism's adherence to those values, and in the fact that settler colonialism, as I hope we would all recognize in this room, is not a historical event. That is, it's not in the past. So you probably knew with that intro I was going to come to Sylvia Wynter. And she says in her big 2003 article on entitled The Coloniality of Being, the struggle as black women, our struggle, sorry, as black women, I realize that I'm white, so I'm citing her. Our struggle as black women has to do with the displacement of the genre of the human man. Wynter proposes that because of this overrepresentation by the genre of man, which is defined in the first part of Wynter's article as in the coloniality of being, power, truth, freedom. Any attempt to unsettle the coloniality of power will call for the unsettling of his overrepresentation. So I'm just glossing her here, saying that this man that is the kind of unit that we think in, for the most part, in what was referred to as the modern world in the earlier panel, is a colonial being by its very nature. Okay. So I want to talk about settler colonial capitalism, and in doing so, I just want to acknowledge where I come from. So we have acknowledged the rights of the people here. I need to acknowledge two other sets of rights. The one is of the country of my birth. So for every $3 or so that might have been spent, if that, in a year on a black education, about $80 was spent on my education. I came from a very poor family, but at the edge of District 6 in Cape Town, but my grandmother on one side, who was wealthier, paid for my education. And the second thing I need to own is that when we had to leave South Africa because my parents were anti-apartheid, I ended up in Canada, and a lot of my education there took place by my living in actually the territory of the Dende and the Inuit in Yellowknife and other indigenous communities in Whitehorse. And that was, and I did my undergraduate in Saskatchewan, so that was a large part of my trying to access the kinds of knowledges that I felt that I needed. So a settler colonial capitalism is the framework through which the human of the World Health Organization is thought. So the problem here is that not only is the human rights that man who also uses that colonial capital concept of man, okay? The problem with this framework, of course, is that it doesn't acknowledge in any way the subventions or loans that have never been repaid through the acquisition by appropriation of indigenous lands and slavery, okay? So it's a framework that only understands labor in the capitalist sense, not in the sense of Aboriginal, Indigenous, and other forms of labor that form outside of that framework. And here I would refer to folks like I will refer later to folks in Indigenous Australia who've done some really grand work on the emotional and physical labor of being an Indigenous person living in under colonial capitalism, and how much massive amount of work has to be done by communities, some of which we had seen beginning and continuing, and not beginning, but continuing this morning. Am I making sense? Cool, okay. So you can tell I'm a crap typist. The colonial character of the human rights is generated in the imperial mode in which pandemics are thought, right? The anthropocentrism, xenophobia, and lack of global rather than national scales of pandemic talk are no match for 21st century pandemics, okay? Taking place in conditions of increasing hypercapitalism. And I'm going to explain that, but my point is that if I'm in one part of my life, I'm a prevention scientist, and I work on gender-based violence in prevention in contexts of extreme poverty. And in those instances, I just want to point out that we cannot access health. So in many of these places, such as the place of the plastic contamination that we saw this morning, and I do realize, as Nancy and I was discussing this, that I'm drinking out of a plastic glass right now, so own up to it. But the plastic contamination is those folks, WHO reads that everybody should have access to the highest standard of health. And I just want to point out, in many environments in the US and elsewhere, the only thing that people can access through health is harm reduction, because the access to health has already been fucked up by colonial capitalism, right? Okay. So this is fifth wave public health theory, and this comes from the team led by Paul Hanlon. So fifth wave public health theory argues that we had public health interventions that made huge inroads. And so the first public health intervention would have been John Snow's discovery of, as is often told in public health history, discovery of the pump as the source of waterborne disease in London in the cholera outbreak. And that's a very big story. Of course, there have been other major waves in public health that have given us major gains. And one of the most recent ones would have been the big interventions into international maternal child health care, which really helped us get a much better birth rate for infant to 5 years of age. The problem with the fifth wave of public health is that they're arguing now, Paul Hanlon and everybody else, that the health issues that we're seeing, which tend to be two sides of the same coin, so malnutrition, diabetes, etc. on the one hand, and overnutrition on the other, these kinds of patterns are no longer, we can no longer get the gains of an intervention or like a single public health intervention, because the ways that we're living are the disease, and the symptoms that we get, which we think are diseases, are actually the sequelae of living the way that we live. So you can't really see the environment isn't the right word, we can't really see the material realities in which we're living in relation to each other and the rest of our non-human animal companions and the world outside of the scope of health. Am I being kind of clear about this? Well, he starts very much better than I do. He starts with, of course, the idea that, of global footprints. He doesn't mention Australia, but Australia has, white Australia, and it's capitalized against population, has a global footprint of 1 in 11, which means, and I think the US is 1 in 9, which means that we would need 9 other worlds, physically speaking, right, for everybody to live the way we live. And so the solution is not, as we've been talking about, to try to get everybody to live the way that those of us who have been privileged live, because the world won't support it. Like literally the physical stuff that we do, there's not enough of it, okay? And I'm arguing that I really like Paul Hanlon and everybody else's identification of this, but I want to go back, as always, to a very specific Indigenous history, which I consider to be my Indigenous history. I know people look at you and see that you're a white South African and they think that you come from somewhere in Europe, but actually my family have been for better or for worse for a couple of generations, at least in South Africa. So just two. They ran away from the Nazis and then landed up in apartheid South Africa eventually. It's kind of like a fat into the frying pan story. Okay. So I want to talk about Indigenous beings. So this is, Carpentaria is from the Wani Indigenous people. This is written by Alexis Wright. It's a novel. Alexis Wright comes from the Wani people of the peninsula, the Carpentaria Peninsula that goes up north of Brisbane in Australia. And she has in this novel a quote from the white mayor of the town, an extractive industry town that she writes about. And And he says, if you can't see it, eat it, or fuck it, it's no good to you, which I think pretty much summarizes the kind of colonial capital kind of relations and the critique of relationality as an extraction industry that we've been talking about, right? I also want to point to my other teachers, which this is the Plains Cree Indigenous novel for Indigenous children who have been abused, and it's wonderful. It's called 7 Generations Ends Begins, and that's because in the Cree cosmology, you have to have at least 7 generations of insight into what you're talking about in order for it to be meaningful in terms of your interrelationality with those to be born and those who are ancestors. That's a kind of South African configuration, but forgive me for that, but that's my way of explaining it. And this is a part where as was discussed this morning, where the Plains Cree children, a set of brothers, are taken into residential school. And in relation to the Manichaean allegory I was referring to earlier, the priest there is continuously washing the younger brother, but it's very clear that he's also abusing him. And you can, for those of you who do image analysis, you will see how beautifully this one page is done in the novel. In the graphic novel, of taking the young child and saying that he's dirty and having to wash him, and him losing his language, which we will come back to in a minute. So man is not human. The human is co-constituted. So one of the things that's absent, although I very much appreciate fifth wave public health theory, one of the things that's absent in it is an approach to the environment not as one in which the human has control. So the next step that fifth wave public health theory doesn't take, but I take because of my mentors and indigenous knowledges that I've learned from the traditions in South Africa that I'll talk about in a minute, very specifically which ones, that man is not in control of the environment. So we have to go one step further and say that we need a co-constituted subjectivity that we can call human, non-human, animal, inanimate matter, and all of those are hyphened. And if anybody wants to know how I deal with this, I have an article in Social Dynamics in which I talk about how I have to really twist English to get it speak to isiXhosa and Zulu concepts, and because in isiZulu, for example, there's no word for environment because there's not the assumption, and I was talking about this with one of our co-panelists yesterday, there's not an assumption that the human is separated from the environment. So environment isn't actually a concept because it cannot be in this co-constituted world that we're talking about. So language does actually matter, which is why I'm in a comparative literature department. Okay. So this is Zeke Mpahlele on African humanism, which I would call deep Ubuntu. And in his generation, he could not. He died in 2007. Okay, Zeke. I should also say that in African humanism, there is no dichotomy between the material world and the spiritual world. There is a continuity reinforced by interrelationships and interconnectedness. That is, animal life, plant life, and inanimate objects have a life of their own, which is part of us. Sounding familiar? Which is why, for instance, the traditional healer will use organic matter to heal the body. It will be something plucked from nature because there is a unity. Part of the continuity is also dramatized by dramatized, he said, by the way in which women will take their afterbirth and bury it in the vicinity of the compound of the house because it symbolizes reincarnation, the cyclical pattern of existence. Now, reincarnation in a Christian, has a completely different meaning. What he's talking about is that in sub-Saharan African cultures, there isn't a binary, between life and death. There is a set of interconnected relationships, tapestried relationships in terms of the first talk this morning, between the unborn, the living, and the dead. And what is more important, of course it's important whether you're dead or alive, but the point is that the connection between the unborn, the yet to be born, the living and the ancestors is what you have to make decisions with in terms of those interrelated set of connections. So how does this work out in health? Well, in very rural areas of Nigeria before it was completely colonized by other kinds of things, you would still find, and you can still find in very rural parts of southern Africa, that we will come across a child who has what would be considered a developmental disability in the modern world. But those are very important children, and they're taken care of by the community even as they grow up and become adults, because they're a sign of an unborn child who didn't make the full transition to being living. And so they represent that connection very, very strongly. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. All right, this is why I should say that I did grow up with Desmond Tutu in the same country. He was the bishop of the hospital that my father was the doctor at, so I know Desmond. He stole our cat basket, but that's another story. We'll have to forgive him for that because of all the other things he did. But we lived in the middle of a very poor country, so that's why it was an issue. But not Zeke, but Desmond has the Christianized Ubuntu, and that is not, much as I love Desi, that's not what I'm referring to here. Okay. So now I'm just going to end with a little bit about how we need to decolonize health history, right? So this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and for those of you who are interested in HIV history, this is the origins of HIV is what we're looking at. So what happened was Leopold II of Belgium owned the Congo during the colonial period, not as a colony. He actually owned it like you would own a cottage. And it was an extractive industry for his personal family. And this was in the rise of the rubber plantation. So South America, from Lima, Peru, one would also know about the rubber and colonial rubber. And in doing this, he urbanized everybody into the Kinshasa region. And the urbanization was very, very quick. It was labor. And what happened was that urbanization and colonization created in an environment in which there were 3 men to every 1 woman in Kinshasa, and they gave those folks injections, and the injections were like vitamin C and D and things like that, multivitamin, but it wasn't, it was presented as obviously always well-being, but it wasn't. It was because he wanted them to be able to produce, to be able to work. So health here is a definition that is actually seen in the Human Rights Declaration, in which health is defined by your ability to work within the colonial capitalism terms, not emotional work or anything like that. Okay? And at this time, we see exactly at this time, because it can be dated back. You know, like how you do carbon dating for objects, you can actually do that for cells and viruses. And HIV comes from this period. It's a period in which there's encroachment and increasing encroachment on indigenous land, and increasing pressure on the land to produce forms of food that weren't traditionally used or were not used in the same number because of this massive flows of colonial capital populations in ways that they had not flowed before in a very short period of time, typical of a kind of colonial capitalism. And that's where HIV generates, okay, at this time, probably from bushmeat. So, but of course, it being Africa, you know, you'd still get students once in a while who come up to you, at least me anyway, and say, well, you know about the oranges, you know, the origin of AIDS. Like, did somebody sleep with a monkey? You know, I'm like, for the love of God, what have you been watching? You know, but anyway, there it is. So this is where I worked for, and still would like to work when COVID is finished. If it ever finishes, which is another part of my story. This is a map of where I worked in Sesonke district in South Africa. On the coast, you see Durban, which is the place that people would be able to recognize. And this is the road that I used to take, a big 4x4 into to the Central mission, which is in the middle of bloody nowhere, except that it was our place and is our place. And there are a lot of women there who taught me a lot of things. Okay. I'm just pointing out that where we worked is not where other people work. So South Africa suffers from a massive amount of HIV tourism research, where they over-research communities that are next to hotels. But these communities are under-researched because there's nowhere to stay. So you stay with your team, much as you might dislike some of them in places where you eat and cook and do everything. There's no place to stay. So you rent a couple of huts or whatever and you do your thing. Okay, that's St. Apollinaris Hospital, and I worked there from before the rollout of highly active antiretroviral therapy, which means that we called that, this is a classic design of hospitals in sub-Saharan Africa and the tropics where there can't be a lift because there's no electricity a lot of the day. So what you have is that huge walkway that comes down, and it's wide enough to take trolleys and so on and so forth. And I would be holding a workshop. Let me see if I can do this. Is this laser working? I can't see it. Don't worry about it. I used to be working. In the rooms behind the trees on what would be the left-hand side of your screen. And in one workshop, which was about 2.5 hours, I was busy doing the workshop on women's rights with a whole bunch of men and women, but my colleagues noticed that 15 or 16 gurneys with dead bodies went down in that period of time from the hospital, and so it became known as Cadaver Way. And those are the kinds of challenges that we're working with. I should also point out that you develop a very sick sense of humor in order to just cope with the environment. So I would ask you not to be too judgmental of us. So I want to point out how we got here. So my point is that COVID, and this is where I'm going to end, that COVID, the COVID-2, that the COVID-19 is the second sudden acute respiratory syndrome. The first one broke in China and Canada in 2003, right? So, and AIDS all come from in colonial capitalist incursions that take place very dramatically and very quickly with no time to adapt in the interaction between humans and non-human animals, and put stress on that relationship. Okay. So there are actually two main strains of HIV, and the first strain, the transmitting species we call it transmitting species because the species, when you work on zoonoses, the species that harbor the disease are not necessarily and are hardly ever the transmitting species, right? So, because many animals can harbor what would be considered pathogens to us but are not pathogens to them. And then you get a crossover normally through another species that then crosses over into humans, right? And to give you a sense of this, we actually don't even know what the transmitting species for Ebola is. We're reasonably sure it's fruit bats, but that has not been proven, even though you see all the time people saying it's fruit bats. Okay. So, and Ebola is a whole other story that I can talk about, but I only got 15 minutes and my time's coming up. So, HIV-1, which is one of the main strains, the transmitting animal was the sooty manga bee. HIV-2, notoriously, it was the common chimpanzee. And so, you really need to understand the relationship between colonialism and bush hunting and African patterns of land use in order to be able to delve into these relations, a point I'm coming to in a minute. Sudden acute respiratory syndrome, the transmitting species was the palm civet. Now, here's my point. We actually don't know the transmitting species yet for COVID-2. And my point is that we don't know enough about the non-human animals and our relations with them in order to be able to figure it out. And just to tell you how this works, everybody figured it must be pangolins because pangolins are lovely creatures, but they're severely exploited, abused, and killed. They're used in China for eating as well as for exotic pet keeping. And while I say that, that's not xenophobic. There are patterns of exotic eating and pet keeping here that I would consider equally egregious. So I want to be clear about that. The trouble is, the trouble is that when you go and you look at COVID-19 in pangolins, and they did the research, and I've got that in a paper I can show you where I've traced it out. The pangolins would have got the virus from humans, not the other way around. So there's no way that they can be the transmitting species in terms of the biology. And this is my last slide. So a decolonial, non-anthropocentric approach enables us to see these zoonoses as actually reverse zoonoses or zooanthroposes. So, okay, the medical point here is that for a long time we look at these, we call them zoonoses, and we say they're coming from non-human animals. But the problem is that we as humans are making rapid, unprecedented incursions in increasingly exponential ways into their living environments, meaning non-human animals. And at the borderline or the mutual zone are usually the poor trying to make an industry of non-human animals because there's no place for them otherwise in colonial capitalism, right? So this is at the systemic level. That is to say, it is the role of man in global development that has brought these diseases to bear through the concentration of human and non-human contact in zones under ecological stress, including bush hunting and farming. And so my thing is, are we going to get rid of COVID-19, or is it going to become, is it going to become with us for the rest of time? Is not really the question. The real question is what is the next COVID-19 going to be, and how are we going to rethink our relationships in order to prevent what I call these man as the pathogen. Hope that's in time. Okay.
Thank you, Rose. And we'll dive right in now to our next speaker is going to be Dr. Krithika Srinivasan. And Dr. Srinivasan is a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Edinburgh. And Dr. Srinivasan's research lies at the intersection of political ecology, post-development politics, animal studies, and nature geographies. She draws on extensive research conducted in South Asia in order to help rethink globally established concepts and practices about nature-society relations in an effort to reconfigure approaches to multi-species justice. Today she's going to be sharing her presentation, Re-animalising Wellbeing, Multi-species Justice After Development. So join me in welcoming her.
I think Rosemary's paper ends at exactly the right point for mine, so thanks for that, Rose. I also have to tell you that it's been less than a year since I've had 3 pairs of glasses, and for this talk I'm going to have to go back and forth between 2, and I'm still not used to doing it, so forgive me if I come across as rather clumsy. Okay, so I'm going to jump straight in, right? So the naming of this geological epoch that we all know as the Anthropocene rests primarily on the negative impacts that contemporary human lifestyles have had on the planet and the other creatures that we share it with, and we're all familiar with that. But what is less talked about is that alongside these negative impacts sits the exact opposite: widespread public concern and action about the adverse consequences and ethical implications of humankind's interactions with non-human nature. So there is harm on the one side, but there's also care, or what is often referred to as the more than human turn. Again, I'm sure a term that all of you here are familiar with. Now, the more than human turn incorporates vital interventions. But in this talk, I would like to argue for a renewed focus on the human as the necessary response to the Anthropocene. So from the more than human, go back to the human. Why do I say this? If we take a step back and look at all the big problems, all the big socio-ecological crises of the Anthropocene, it becomes clear that very little of it is linked to malevolence. Rather, the Anthropocene and its socio-ecological crises are the side effects of collective societal efforts to improve human well-being, what is now commonly referred to as development. Whether agriculture, buildings, trains, flush toilets, or dams, these are all activities that seek to improve human life, but at the same time undermine it through unintended negative consequences. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, development-induced displacement, they're just some examples. So the puzzle here is this: how is it that something that is meant to promote human well-being ends up harming people, both directly, such as through development-induced displacement, and indirectly by harming nature? To understand this, I'd like us to look more closely at the vision of human well-being that lies at the heart of development. It is a vision of a good human life as something that is A, achieved through insulation from the threats posed by nature and the vulnerabilities that are inherent to living as part of nature, including death itself. And B, something that involves the maximization of a range of capacities that are considered to be uniquely human and that are beyond our capacities as biological organisms, as mere animals, including intelligence. And some of us were discussing this yesterday after the session. So think about those things that are considered essential to a good human life in contemporary times. A long life, housing that protects us from the vagaries of the weather and the elements, air conditioning, ready and assured access to food, healthcare that protects us from pathogens, cancerous cells, and diabetes, and also education, internet access, energy-powered transport, the occasional holiday, art, clothes, phones, computers. These are all things that we take for granted and that we expect that other people should be taking for granted as well. Now, these are all things that insulate us from nature and separate us from all other animals. I'm still to meet a dog that has his or her own mobile phone. Take the most basic of development indicators, right, in the Human Development Index, and that is of life expectancy. That most basic of development indicators is predicated on the human capacity to circumvent the risks that are inherent to living as part of the more than human world, of being animal. And that is something that societies across the world strive for. I mean, we can argue about whether it's a Eurocentric understanding of well-being or not, but at the end of the day, that is something that has been more or less universalized, barring very isolated societies in these days. Now, the process involved in securing each and everything that is considered necessary for this vision of well-being, for development, involve the use, exploitation, and redesign of non-human nature. Now, that's quite obvious. These processes also harm vulnerable human communities. So they have ecological, animal, and social justice implications, what we can think of as multi-species justice implications, covering both people and the rest of nature, and nature as collectivities, which is what I mean when I refer to ecological impacts, and nature as individuals, which is what I refer to in the context of animal justice. Animal agriculture, for example, is one of the biggest drivers of habitat loss in today's world, and one of the biggest anthropogenic causes of climate change. It also has food security implications. So far from feeding the world, animal agriculture does the opposite because of the diversion of food crops and land used for arable agriculture from socioeconomically marginal communities to the production of higher value animal source foods, which at the end of the day go into the plates of people like us, wealthier people. Modern medicine is similarly built on the exploitation of non-human organisms for the manufacture and safety testing of healthcare products, and in some instances, including recent COVID vaccination trials, the exploitation of marginalized people. So that is not just in the past, it's something that is ongoing. Modern healthcare involves the delay of human mortality and the reduction of human vulnerability to disease by deliberately creating disease and ill health in and hastening the deaths of other animals and sometimes other people. So what is development? Development, at the most basic level, is about amplifying those human features that are believed to be maximally different from other animals. The idea of human well-being that underpins development is, in some ways, the the ultimate expression of anthropocentrism and its zoopolitical logics. I promised some people here yesterday that I would throw in some like jargon, so here's the jargon for you. And I'm not going to explain it. We can look at that term in the Q&A if required. Now, the zoopolitical logics of anthropocentrism play a key role in the pursuit of human well-being by rendering non-human life killable, right? It makes it possible for us to transform the rest of nature, exploit the rest of nature, displace and kill the rest of nature without worrying too much about it. Now, these logics also relegate as inferior and displaceable those human ways of life that are less insulated from the risks posed by nature. And this displacement occurs in different ways. It occurs through direct displacement. It occurs through logics of upliftment. So if somebody lives in a hut, we subject them to development so that they live in the sorts of buildings that we do. If somebody doesn't have access to the kind of education we think is important, we roll out these education programs to make them all literate of the kind that Rosemary was talking about. So there's multiple ways through which people are also displaced by the zoopolitical logics of anthropocentrism, which are about making humankind and all of humankind more than animal and along certain directions. Now, the multi-species justice impacts of the developmental quest, that is the social, ecological, and animal justice impacts, are hard to challenge because they're easily justified with reference to the trump card of human well-being. So dams may displace people, destroy habitats, kill thousands of animals, but at the end of the day, they bring water, they allow for irrigated agriculture, they bring us electricity, right? They allow us to go on holidays, provide us with nice leisure spots. So there are always like 1,500 like positive things to kind of justify every sort of justice impact of a development activity that is carried out to pursue this vision of well-being. So social, ecological, and animal justice impacts become mere unfortunate collateral damages. So in essence, development and the pursuit of human well-being that it aims for is characterized by twinned logics of protection sacrifice, wherein improved human lives at the societal level are sought via protection that inevitably goes alongside the sacrifice of lesser others, both human and non-human. So it's just like protection and sacrifice go alongside in the developmental pursuit of societal human well-being. The entrenchment of these logics of protection sacrifice can be seen in the response to COVID-19, and there is the pandemic part of it. Now, COVID lockdowns, which some of you might be familiar with, but which I experienced first in the UK and then in India, where I spent 13 months during COVID. COVID lockdowns are exemplary developmental measures. They're aimed at protecting humankind from a non-human threat, and in doing so have serious negative impacts on vulnerable people by suddenly depriving them of their livelihoods. While COVID lockdowns were meant to protect everyone, in reality, the health benefits they offered were predominantly restricted to the non-poor, those who had the resources to be distanced from others. COVID lockdowns mirror development projects such as dams in their inequitable distribution of costs and benefits. But this was apparent right from the beginning, and yet these lockdowns were repeatedly deployed and justified by narratives about safeguarding humanity, just as development justifies itself. And these lockdowns were justified and advocated even by those who would be normally critical of development-induced displacement, which is what I found really interesting about the lockdowns at that point in time. Now, more crucially, the response to COVID, and not just the lockdowns, but the wider response to COVID, has replicated the very same logics and processes that created the conditions of possibility for the infection in the first place, which is what Rosemary ended with. If it is true that the virus has its origins in some animals that are considered wildlife, whether they're pangolins or not, and if it is true that people have always cohabited with wildlife, which is what's political ecology, which is my and John's home discipline, then how is it that we face what is seen as a dangerous to human society pandemic? Right? It can't be just proximal interactions between human society and wildlife, including the consumption of wild animal meat. That is not new. People have always eaten the meat of what we now think of as wild animals. What has changed are the social conditions under which these interactions take place. These include the farming of domestic animals, the globalized character of human settlements and lifestyles, the transformation of landscapes and their multi-species inhabitants everywhere that has enabled zoonotic transmission and rapid contagion. Right? All these changed social conditions fall under the umbrella of development. So it's not just about the eating of wild animal meat or bushmeat. It's about the context, the conditions under which this takes place. Now, it is these very same logics of development that the response to COVID reproduces in the use of sanitizers and disposable personal protective equipment, the exploitation of animals for vaccine production, and measures such as lockdowns that have caused immense social displacement. So the year of COVID, thus, to me, is, people keep talking about the new normal, but for me, it has been emblematic of the developmental status quo, where the sacrifice of marginalized human and non-human others is justified as necessary in the interest of collective well-being, in the interest of global well-being. So in essence, the most troubling social and more than human concerns of our times are tied closely to a positive vision of what humans are and how their well-being can be achieved. As such, I'd argue that it becomes futile to challenge these activities without querying the more than animal vision of humanity that they are directed by. So more specifically, what I wonder if what is needed is the fundamental resetting of existing visions of human well-being, the replacement of humankind in the rest of Earth, in the rest of nature, through the re-animalisation of human well-being. From a vision of a good human life as involving insulation from the vulnerabilities inherent in living on this planet, we need to examine what it means to really live as part of nature on the planet, and more equitably distribute the risks of living on this earth so that they're not borne primarily by marginal people and nature. How might we approach this task? We might start by asking what it means to live like other animals do. This might entail upturning some of our most basic ideas of what human well-being is. Now, in the Anthropocene, the idea of ontological non-dualism is widely accepted. That, the idea that there are no strict divisions between human society and the rest of nature. Everything is social nature, another political ecological term. And yet, most scholarship and practice on this subject retains a vision of human well-being that rests on ethical dualism. So on the one hand, there's this widespread acceptance of ontological non-dualism, that we're all like materially part of nature, society and nature entangled. But when it comes to questions of ethics and politics, humankind is still seen as somehow above and more privileged than the rest of nature. And in the written version of this paper, I would say there are ethical dualisms and exceptionalisms that are prevalent when we think about different non-human organisms as well. So basically, we have a situation where we retain a vision of human well-being that rests on ethical dualisms and the zoopolitical logics that these ethical dualisms are underpinned by. So it remains unimaginable, I'm sure even to those of us in this room, that humans should live like the rest of nature, like other animals, with shorter lifespans perhaps, and unsupported by the infrastructures of medicine and engineering that currently insulate most societies. So how can we invert this logic of development and current visions of human well-being so as to relocate within nature those humans that lead the most insulated lives? Instead of displacing marginal human communities and trying to uplift and develop them, how can we learn from their everyday practices to live gently and tread lightly on the planet? On a practical everyday level, what might it look like if we, those of us in this room, abandoned exceptionalist visions of the human and replaced people as nature? It might mean that I start benefiting from all those animal lives that have been sacrificed at the altar of biomedicine. It might mean that I learn to cohabit with rats, tigers, elephants, cockroaches, gulls, wolves, pigeons, instead of expecting far-off people in central India or Zimbabwe to protect wildlife. It might mean that a person being killed by an elephant or a virus is seen as no worse than a person being killed by a car. It might mean that I stop viewing human life as somehow more not killable than other animal life. Much of the more than human turn has been focused on challenging the killability of the non-human, especially animals. Is killability a term that all of you are familiar with? So killability basically refers to social status, right? It refers to the idea that if something or someone is killed, then it becomes something that needs to be subject to sanction or at least inquiry. Now, just because human beings are not killable, it doesn't mean that they're not killed, but the act of killing can be potentially a crime. And a lot of the more than human turn, both scholarship and practice, has been about challenging the killability of animals, right? Saying that animals should not be killable, and we should, make them less killable. But what I want to argue is that we need to reverse this. So the approach of re-animalization would turn this on the head and would instead dismantle the special status of humankind as not killable. So instead of making animals less killable, we need to think about making humankind more killable. Take, for instance, the basic life activity of feeding. While the ways in which human societies have institutionalized the farming of animals, or indeed farming for food, has received critical attention, the assumption that humans are not and ought not to be food for other animals has remained mostly unquestioned, which is something that I think Omar was talking about earlier today. Now, re-animalization would entail dismantling this deeply entrenched norm. If humans can kill and eat other animals, then the reverse should be an integral part of more than human relations. Re-animalization would mean that humans become killable for food, whether for and by tigers or mosquitoes, both. So both charismatic, valued animals like tigers and mosquitoes, which I think all of us don't want around on this planet. So in some ways, this is a response to the question posed by the person sitting behind Claire. It's a sort of modernist understanding of reciprocity. Dismantling the taken for granted non-killability of humankind will generate fresh questions of equity. And these were questions that came up in yesterday's discussion after the keynote as well. Non-killability varies across lines of socioeconomic privilege among humankind. The developmental response to this is to enhance the non-killability of those who are socially marginalized, usually by emphasizing their humanness. Re-animalization would entail inverting this approach to justice and injustice. Instead of tackling social inequities through practices of improvement that cause multi-species injustices, the task would be to redistribute the dangers that are inherent to life on Earth so that they're equally borne by all those human and non-human that inhabit the planet. So instead of trying to uplift the marginalized, we would be thinking about de-insulating privileged humans, and I include all of us in this room among the ranks of the privileged. Now, I've struggled with these thought experiments, for they're very far from how we have all been schooled to think about ourselves and the other beings that share our species identity. So I will conclude with a set of questions. The very idea of re-animalization is bound to generate problems given the material and political force that the idea of dehumanization has. How then can the negative coding of the animal be reconfigured to establish becoming and being animal as an achievement as opposed to a demotion of ethico-political status? In the interim, how can we reframe, denounce, and combat the material processes associated with dehumanization in ways that don't entail resorting to zoopolitical exceptionalisms? What narratives and strategies might be helpful in shifting societal imaginations from the focus on shoring up human and non-human lives to relearning how to be vulnerable and to live as one among the many forms of life on Earth? What might be entailed in the redistribution of the risks of living on the planet as a means of addressing social and more than human inequities? Now, these are questions that are simultaneously ontological, epistemological, and ethical, but I think are questions that are vital for constructing pathways to multi-species justice in a world that I think is ruined by development. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be joining us on Zoom. And so I'll begin the introduction as they get up on screen. Our next speaker is Dr. Chen-Hsing Tsai. And Dr. Chen-Hsing Tsai holds a PhD in literature. He's currently a professor in the department chair in the English department at Tamkang University in Taiwan. His Areas of specialization include eco-criticism, climate change fiction, and environmental science fiction. He's currently the president of the Association of Comparative Literature, English and American Literature of the Republic of China, Taiwan, and president of the Association of the Study of Literature and Environment of the Republic of China, editor of the Tamkang Review and Anglo-American Literary Review, and has co-edited Introduction to Ecological Literature, Key Readings in Eco-Criticism, and as well as co-edited Language, Culture, and Information Technology. His monologue entitled Ecological Crisis in Literary Studies won the 2019 Academia Sinica Humanities and Social Sciences Book Prize. He's going to be sharing a presentation today. Do we have him?
He's there.
Yes, okay. Going to be sharing a presentation today, Climate Change, Zoonosis, and Narratives of Disease in Lawrence Wright's The End of October. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tsai.
It's midnight in Taiwan, sorry to say. I count myself very fortunate to be able to attend this meeting. I want to thank the organizing committee, and I also want to thank Victoria Green for their thoughtfulness and kindness. Thank you. And today I'm going to, I changed my title a little bit. And today my title is called Virology, Immunology, and Ecology in Lawrence Wright's The End of October. Okay, now I'll read my paper. The term Anthropocene was first put forth by Eugene Stomer in the 1980s and later promulgated by Paul Cruson with the intention of reflecting upon industrial revolution and how mankind has utilized the Earth's resources in such a way as to induce global warming and other disease-related problems. Lawrence Wright's The End of October is such a novel exploring how climate change leads to a global pandemic. In The End of October, a so-called Congolese virus has plagued the world. The pathogen, originally buried in ice on the October Revolution Island, was exposed due to global warming, thus bringing deep time into congruence with historical time and rendering the pandemic possible. In the first part of the novel, a kindergarten teacher took her students to visit the Mammoth Museum. However, at the end of the novel, the mammoth is no longer an exhibit of the prehistorical period, but has become real right before the reader's eyes. And the overlap of two temporalities, deep time and historical time, is no longer anachronistic, but seamless situated via a time loop between reality and the real. This unlikely liaison of two temporalities have finally caused a public health problem, the spread of emerging infection zoonotic disease. Now, part one. The outbreak narrative. Wright's novel, The End of October, is an outbreak narrative about virus spread, quarantine, the zoonotic diagram, and public health. In literature and medicine studies, the medical humanities highlight the importance of narrative medicine, narrative of illness, and pathography, while the critical medical humanities pay more attention to the limits of narrative or anti-narrative. The health humanities even tries to open up the canon to embrace diverse forms of narrative, including memoirs, narratives by caregivers, and new media studies. In her seminal book entitled Contagious Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative, Priscilla Ward coined the term the outbreak narrative to refer to an evolving story of disease emergence. Though this book was published in 2008, it still plays an influential role, especially in an era of the COVID-19 pandemic. Delia Schweitzer aptly observed that an outbreak narrative begins with the discovery of emerging infection and follows it as it spreads, documenting the journey to contain or neutralize it. In vital Modernism, the influenza pandemic and interwar literature. Elizabeth Alcott argues that in the pandemic narrative, illness and the body have become more central. In general, the outbreak narrative conforms to the following patterns. Number one, as is often the case, it takes place in a remote place. Number two, there is disease transmission on and off. Number three, the mortality rates are reported. Number four, the regulations of health policies are enacted. Number five, governmental research is conducted. And finally, number six, the pandemic is contained. For me, the pandemic outbreak narrative can enrich the nature and scope of illness narrative with a view to broadening the horizon of exploitation in the study of the medical humanities, the critical humanities, and the health humanities. Part two, Henry Parsons as virology. In the end of October, the main character is Henry Parsons, a virologist, as well as deputy director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. After participating in an epidemiological meeting convened by the World Health Organization, Henry's supervisor, Maria Savona, sent him forthwith to Indonesia to look into an emerging infectious virus case. For Henry and Maria, this virus perhaps has an epidemic nature, and it might carry some clinical characteristics. Henry's parents were missionaries. When he was only 4 years old, they died in an air crash while on a mission in South America. Henry, from his youth, has been overshadowed by this event and has been deeply afraid of religion. Unlike his parents, he subscribed to the belief that only science is able to protect him. In the novel, Henry was short and slightly deformed due to a childhood case of rickets. Despite his diminished appearance, he was resilient. While in the camp, Henry could see rodents everywhere, and he was bitten by fleas several times, yet he was not infected by the Congolese virus. Therefore, Henry surmises that the virus should be different from the medieval source of plague infection. For Henry, the interaction between humans, viruses, and microbes suggests that the virus is to be seen as an element in a set or an actor in a community. As viruses and microbes are potentially contagious, they also do work that might have consequences in a society. Similarly, Watt shares the idea that the incorporations of the carriers or new microbes into society might constitute human and non-human as an imagined community, a term used by Benedict Anderson to refer to the birth of a nation, print technology, and how community is imagined on a national scale. Part 3, community and immunity. For Anderson, an imagined community belongs with kinship and religion, a definition resembling that of John Luke Nancy's idea of community, in sync with Heideggerian sense of being with. For Watt, however, this term is too straightforward. What Watt means here is that community is to be supplemented with immunity. She explains that it is vital to depict community as an immunological ecosystem in a distinctly national and medical frame. For me, Watt's ecological insights are congruous with the Italian philosopher Robert Esposito's theorizations of community and immunity. In his trilogy on biopolitics, Esposito employs 3 key concepts: community, immunity, and bios, to analyze the biopolitical situations of modern society. Esposito notes that Community, in a traditional sense, mobilizes the individuals to share a common identity. However, Exposito endows it with a different meaning, namely, community is not about closeness or propinquity, but about a unity in distance and of distance. Etymologically, the term in community means being with, while minus is characterized by the improper, meaning one's debt or gift that is not returned. Esposito's redefinition defies underlying presupposition that community is positive, harmonious, and proper. His idea of community seems to suggest putting together a part, and immunity should be understood as a frontier, a dividing line that brings us back within ourselves by cutting off all contact with the outside. There are two attitudes that scholars hold towards the Congolese virus, the contagionists and the non-contagionists. The contagionists believe that commodities, goods, and travelers probably have disseminated the germs from one place to another. Consequently, they approve of isolation. However, the non-contagionists believe that isolation is of no use and furthermore has caused the loss of economic and commercial activity. In the novel, the Dutch scholar Hans Somebody is a non-contagionist, believing that the main source of the Congolese pathogen is from raw milk. On the contrary, Henry believes that Congolese infection is highly contagious and has a direct risk of infection. For Henry, immunity and community are woven together. They are not oppositional, but pharmacological. Part 4, Ecology of the Viruses. At the end of the first part of the novel, it is implied that the Congolese virus originates from migratory birds. The WHO has already found it in migratory birds too. In Henry's point of view, the Congolese virus is also a kind of emergency, the hemorrhagic fever. Those infected by this epidemic usually die within 2 weeks. It is sad to say that Henry's wife Jill was infected by the Congolese virus. When burying her mother, Helen discovered that, I quote, her mother's mouth was open. She was blue, like the porcelain lamp on her bedside table. And there was a trail of blood all over the sheets, and in little dry rivulets from her eyes and ears and nose. This is what God did to my mother, Helen thought, end quote. Jill's symptoms manifest cytokine storm, resulting in breathing, cyanosis, and fever. Earlier, Henry saw 3 doctors without borders with the same condition. Henry originally thought that they were break doctors, but after carefully examining them, their faces were in fact not break, but blue. Henry's first studied bacteria-induced diseases such as plague and tuberculosis. He respects bacteria, believing that, I quote, we couldn't be who we are without them, end quote. As a scientist, he even goes to the October Revolution Island to complete his zoonotic diagram. I quote, Henry uses his map to brush the snow away, exposing a giant face. The furry tassel had been ripped apart by the polar bears. It is a mammoth, said Henry. Don't touch it. It's contaminated with Congolese. The seals backed away. Well, doctor, what are we going to tell the story, the history? Kuzi asked. Henry looked up. The last flag of Siberian cranes has taken flight, headed for China. We are going to say that we did this to ourselves, end quote. In this citation above, the final words consist of Henry's ecological enlightenment. I quote, "We are going to say that we did this to ourselves," end quote. Henry is not an ecocentrist, but certainly he criticized anthropocentrism, suggesting that the phenomenon of global warming or climate change is caused by humankind, and that, as Professor Tuana insightfully points out, ecological indifference will have a long-term negative impact on environmental and human health. So here is the zoonotic diagram. My conclusion: history is no longer anthropocentric. It is suggested to encompass the history of the virus and the histories of the mutual interaction of the virus and mankind, because we are viral subjects. As Henry contends, it is pointless to ascribe consciousness or intentionality to a disease. Wright's novel suggests that humans need to study viruses and learn from the past, and from it understand that humans and non-humans, humans and viruses, and nature and culture do not stand in opposition, but are mutually entangled in an asymmetrical relationship. Thank you.
Our final speaker in this panel will be Catherine Whitlock. She is a PhD student in the School of Arts, Technology, and Emerging Communication at the University of Texas at Dallas. Her research is at the intersection of feminist science and technology studies, media studies, surveillance studies, and animal studies. She's part of the Public Interactives Research Lab, which pursues speculative design practice to investigate how technologies take place in public spaces, and also the Fashioning Circuits Lab, which addresses the social and cultural implications of the intersection between fashion and technology. Today, she's going to be sharing her presentation, Caring in the Anthro-Capitalist The Entanglement of Butterflies, Citizen Science, and Surveillance. Join me in welcoming Ms. Whitlock.
Apologies for any confusion. I did update my title to reflect some changes. So today I'll be presenting my paper entitled Deceptive Data, the God Trick at Play in Digital Citizen Science. Recently, there have been increasingly alarming developments in the welfare of butterflies. In Mission, Texas, a nearby city to McAllen, the National Butterfly Center resides on a 100-acre nature preserve dedicated to plants and wildlife conservation. The space is open to 240 species of butterflies and almost 300 species of birds, in addition to endangered plants and protected wildlife species that are being displaced by land development, commercial agriculture, climate change, and border wall construction. Unfortunately, the center is now inundated with white supremacist onslaughts. In February, the center closed indefinitely due to unfounded attacks stemming from white supremacists, heteropatriarchal QAnon followers, and other far-right conspiracists who claim that the center is a haven for human trafficking and illegal migration. However, QAnon, a product of digitally networked platforms, is not the only digital platform threatening the survival and conservation of butterflies. My paper examines the Citizen Science Project and real-time online database eButterfly to investigate the limits and potential of digital citizen science as participatory media. While citizen science has been lauded as one potential remedy in the multiple fronts of combating loss of biodiversity and species extinction, a deeper examination of eButterfly suggests that things are more complicated. By examining through the lens of data feminism, articulated most recently by Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio in their book Data Feminism, eButterfly's method of presenting data, I argue, reifies rather than interrupts the underlying Enlightenment epistemologies that are imbricated in species destruction. I argue that eButterfly remains entangled in a system that seeks to exploit animal bodies and hinders this citizen scientific project's ability to engage in ethical treatment and care of butterflies and the environment. eButterfly is an international, real-time online checklist and photo storage program that allows people to input and access data about butterflies in Central and North America. Through the checklist data detailing documentations of the presence or absence of butterfly species, this database provides basic information on butterfly distribution and phenology at various spatial and temporal scales throughout the region. Their goal is to illuminate understanding of ecological and agricultural systems in the region by collecting individual experiences of watching butterflies in the form of checklists, which are then archived and freely shared to catalyze new data-driven approaches to science, conservation, and education. The web interface invites participants to submit their observations through a series of interactive prompts that encourage users to participate frequently by providing tools that retain their personal observations and photographs. eButterfly also enables participants to visualize data through interactive maps, bar charts, and graphs. On the eButterfly homepage, large gallery photos of butterflies and chrysalids appear above the stats section. Within this section, users can view the amount of species, checklists, observations, and observers for the current month, the current year thus far, or all since the creation of the database. In order to submit information about when, where, and how a butterfly was observed, a butterfly watcher must create an account. Once it's created, the user can input relevant information about the butterfly. And over time, each participant's photographs, checklists, identifications, and observations form the database. According to eButterfly, this data is shared with a global community of community scientists, educators, students, lepidopterists, conservationists, and land managers. In theory, everyone can contribute to this database and everyone can view it, but not everyone does. As a platform in participatory culture, it ideally should close a participation gap. It is not enough to simply create this technology. It must be made accessible and expanded into a functional multi-language database in order to avoid concretizing geopolitical exclusions. Although attempting to be open and inclusive, eButterfly reinscribes racism and geopolitical power relations by rendering the Global South invisible in this database. While this project claims to be dedicated to understanding the distribution of butterflies in the context of global changes, eButterfly only added Spanish to their website in the last year, and only some pages are fully translated. The project's inadequate Spanish translations means that the current data on butterflies is biased and has limited perspective. For example, there are very few entries from Mexico, which may be due to the fact that during most of its 10-year existence, the site has only been available to French and English language speakers. The data map only presents data collected in North America and parts of Central America. Therefore, not enough data is collected in Central and South America, where butterflies are most prolific. Spanish is one of the major languages spoken in the Neotropical realm, which spans from Mexico to southern South America, and this is the most species-rich area on Earth. The Neotropics also contain the largest number of butterfly families and subfamilies. Therefore, the spotty data recorded on the website about Peru, which has a high abundance of butterflies, suggests that the linguistic exclusionary practices of the website are causing data absence for this area. The apparent lack of data contradicts current investigations that suggest that Peru has more than 3,700 butterfly species, more than any other country and equal to approximately 20% of the world's butterfly population, and 4,200 more species are expected to be discovered. Additionally, every November, millions of butterflies overwinter in central Mexico and the Oyamel forest. Thus, eButterfly's faulty translation of a major language results in skewed data from the perspective of the global north. The site's geopolitical exclusionary practices visually reify data and knowledge as emanating from the global north of English and French-speaking countries, and functionally limits the amount of data from Spanish-speaking people and hinders their ability to participate. This begs the question, for something as urgent as the global decline of butterflies, why would a project specifically dedicated to combating this risk the insect's survival because they do not offer an inclusive and multi-language website? Why are we limited to this perspective? Feminist scholars have argued that data is neither neutral nor unbiased. Building on this, I argue that eButterfly is another database that supports this notion. Though this project is citizen and public-based and attempts to engage the general public in critical conversations about the environment and threats surrounding butterfly population decline, eButterfly reproduces reductionist methods of science which maintains forms of social and cultural power. Voices are missing in the volunteer base. Therefore, I hold that there are many points for data feminist intervention and activism in this project. In Data Feminism, de Ignacio and Klein examine the unequal power structures and the fear of data and illuminate some of the attempts made to remedy them. The book explicates the ways in which these power dynamics manifest in our contemporary data-driven society. The authors ask, if data is power, then who benefits from it? Who do we leave out of our data and why? And how do we use data to maintain power structures? The authors argue that data justice recognizes power differentials and the historical inequalities and can work toward dismantling them. De Ignacio and Klein flesh out how both data and their representations reflect and reproduce racism, sexism, and colonialism. I use de Ignacio and Klein to support my argument that eButterfly's linguistic exclusionary practices act as a form of data injustice. eButterfly's data map presents a view that does not show any particular scientist, lepidopterist, or citizen's perspective. Instead, its view is a totalizing one. It makes a visual claim that it presents the big picture of the globe. The data map appears truthful, objective, and free of bias. This universal and default position, described by feminist science studies scholar Donna Haraway as the God trick, renders invisible both the human labor involved in constructing the map and the ideologies of objectivity and scientific truth that inform their work. The God's eye trick in the map is that through exclusionary language practices, it presumes a God's eye view of the global North, which asserts that citizen science is only practiced in the North. The North is considered the default here, the universal perspective, as is the team's perspective behind eButterfly. If eButterfly is to function as a feminist platform aimed for multi-species flourishing, Sandra Harding's concept of strong objectivity should be applied as it draws on standpoint epistemologies and operationalizes the idea that knowledge is socially situated. This concept offers advice to researchers and calls them to examine the role of social situations in the formation of knowledge in order to expose background assumptions and cultural agendas. Ultimately, eButterfly and its limited opportunities reify the divide between the global North and South, as it does not include the possibility to have perspectives and observations from a majority of people in South America or anyone who does not speak English or French. Because eButterfly's map practices linguistic exclusionism, it reinforces the typical borders of the North and the South, the very same borders that white supremacists are so intent on enforcing. Furthermore, by examining eButterfly's data map, we can further understand the dominant ideologies that underpin modern immigration law, policy, and rhetoric, which are built upon the rejection of the other as being feminine or an outsider. eButterfly perpetuates a long and deeply worrisome legacy of othering and marginalizing communities of color by embodying white supremacy and masculinist modes of rationalized data visualization practices that supports the God's eye trick. This aligns with border militia groups that espouse QAnon theories that enforce rigid borders between the global North and South through violence, incarceration, and deportation of the other. I argue eButterfly's linguistic practices and the white supremacist attacks on the Butterfly Center share an ideology of exclusion. While beyond the scope of this paper, more work should be done to understand the unsettling resonance between United States immigration enforcement and eButterfly's instructions for identification. For example, in U.S. immigration enforcement, catch and release entered political lexicon during the George W. Bush administration. This refers to the practice of releasing a migrant to the community while they await hearings in immigration court as an alternative to holding them in immigration detention centers. Similarly, eButterfly encourages a type of insect identification also called catch and release. Humans are encouraged to touch, hold, or contain a butterfly for an extended amount of time in order to garner information on them for a later judgment. These incitements to catch and release are violent, as touching an insect can potentially cause damage to its body. These are rooted in Enlightenment naturalist epistemologies that position non-human animal life as an object of scientific discovery. When applied to migrating humans, such terminology renders them outside the human. At its most basic level, eButterfly's cyber infrastructure is contingent on a database, networking, and computational technologies. Thus, eButterfly reveals how these technologies can expand, maintain, and support a community of citizen scientists whose collaboration may be the sole means to collect massive amounts of data required to recognize some of the central biological impacts of global environmental change. However, this potential for democratizing research is in tension with its potential for harm. The success of eButterfly as an online citizen scientific program depends on the strength and diversity of its participants and stakeholders. Unfortunately, eButterfly falls short in affording the opportunities to participate in a global movement to areas outside of North America and to people who do not speak English or French. Ideally, any human who has an interest in butterflies can participate in this global project. However, harmful underlying epistemologies and power structures prevent this. This is deeply disconcerting as global climate change and land degradation are just a few of the issues that demand understanding processes at both continental and global scales. Therefore, the fact that eButterfly only recently added Spanish and still does not have the entire website fully translated contradicts their goal for a global participation at a local level. The exclusion of Spanish language participants itself appears to reflect a Eurocentric view of who can participate in saving the world. This aligns with QAnon's white supremacist worldview. White heteropatriarchal settlers will save the world from the evils that QAnon imagines bedevil it. Thank you.
All right, well, we have about 20 minutes to do some Q&A. So I would like to first thank all of our panelists again. So if you all join me in thanking them one more time. And I would like to just immediately turn to the audience. I'll walk around with the microphone and hand it to folks. Does anyone have a question to start?
Hello, thank you. Thanks to all the panelists. It was wonderful to hear a variety of topics. My question's more directed at Dr. Srinivasan. There was a question that you brought up towards the end, especially as it relates to an invitation to becoming more animal. I don't know if that was an explicit invitation that you are extending, or that's a possibility that opens up with your research. But the question, or at least the concern that I seem to have with such an invitation is that usually these invitations have a good intention at the end. The intention is maybe revise our attitude towards the world, how we relate to killable humans and non-humans. I'm just using that distinction here just because it's already in the colloquial language. But instead, it could get corrupted, like most things, like good invitations get corrupted. And instead, it could become something, and I can already picture this, because I have an intuition for how this happens, is that there becomes a fantasy of what an animal is, or what it means to be animal-like, what it means to live in nature. And people glorify that, or they enter into that world of fantasy instead of understanding what's at stake here if we don't become animal. And I was wondering, maybe revising this something like just refusing intervention. So these refusing developmental intervention. It's like, you know what? I don't want your education, or I don't want you to build this house over here. So in that mere refusal, you're not taking a clear stance of like, I'm choosing to be animal. It may be interpreted as such by those people who are developmentally focused. They're like, oh, they're barbarians, they're animals, they're not seeking to develop. But in the mere distancing, there is not an invitation or an explicit invitation to become animal, and you don't get tempted into this I guess this semi-twisted way of interpreting this invitation to become animal, which could end up being like just merely ending in a world of fantasy. I was wondering if you could respond to that. Do you think that's a relevant critique, or is this something you've considered?
Yeah. gets co-opted, everything gets corrupted. And I think the same would apply to this. But that doesn't mean that we don't think about fresh ways of approaching some of these problems, because the long-standing ways of approaching this has been an approach which I think of as, as shoring up, whether it's been of marginal people or the rest of nature, to kind of enjoy the same sort of ethical status that privileged humankind has and the fruits of development or well-being. But that in itself has been co-opted, been corrupted, and has created fresh problems. Every time you try to solve a problem, it creates a new set of problems. So I guess this talk and the paper that it's based on is about, how can we reverse that? Doesn't mean that reversing the approach would work smoothly, and it does stand the risk of being corrupted, co-opted, misused, whatnot. The specific question that I posed was not an invitation of becoming animal, though the whole paper was about re-animalization and can be seen as an invitation to become more animal, but was this thing about, like, given that the animal has a very negative connotation, given the way in which we've been schooled to think about human well-being, where the idea of dehumanization has been central to how we think about the injustices perpetrated on marginal human communities. The question that I posed towards the end of the talk was one of, how do we change that way of thinking so that being or becoming animal is something that is an achievement as opposed to being a demotion of ethical or political status. But at the same time, I guess that kind of reversal of that coding would also need to go alongside concrete strategies on combating what are now seen as proceeds of dehumanization, but in a way that doesn't resort to the tropes of exceptionalism or zoopolitical exceptionalism that have been used so far to combat those proceeds. So that's to answer one part of your question. There was another part which I've forgotten. Which, can you repeat? Yeah.
Ultimately, would it be better, because I was suspicious.
Yes.
Would it be better to say, I'm refusing intervention, developmental intervention?
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat the question real quick for those on Zoom. The question was, would it be better to just simply say I'm refusing developmental intervention?
So that would, to refuse something, you would refuse that, again, because you have vision in mind. So in a way, this talk and the paper that it's based on was based on other people's critique of my own work, where they're like, you're always criticizing things. Are you ever going to come up with a positive vision, like a sense of what we can do, right? And so the only positive vision that I could come up with, which might, and that could be my fault and my lack of imagination, is that of, like, actually having this idea of being like other animals as a sort of thumb rule, not as a model, but as a thumb rule for how we engage with the world and how we inhabit the world. Right? And if we were to, and I'm just thinking this through because I haven't thought about it in the terms that you have posed the question. If we were to kind of frame it as refusing developmental interventions, there might be other interventions that don't go under the rubric of development, but would anyway replicate the same sorts of issues. So and development at the end of the day is an articulation of becoming more than animal. Right? There could be other ways of doing it, just like capitalism is an articulation of development, and there's a lot of literature that now shows that even non-capitalist societies perpetuate the same sort of excesses that capitalism does, right? So I guess that would be my worry. The other thing is also that instead of I would again say, like, to ensure that we don't place the onus on marginal people in this task. Instead of thinking about who's going to refuse education, we need to think about how do all of us who enjoy the fruits of development refuse those interventions, right? We have already been subject to a certain kind of education. What do we do then, right? We can't refuse it. So I guess that will be my way of thinking about it.
Any other questions for the panel?
Thank you. We have a question from Mayari on Zoom. Sorry, I'm trying to get my screen to scroll up to the message. Amazing presentations, thank you. I enjoyed each one. I have a question for Krithika. Some of the works I've read concerning poor, rural, indigenous communities tend to romanticize poverty, perceiving everything that is modern as pretentious or unnecessary, and portraying poor people as more creative or not in need of modern materials. But I've seen that this idea undermines their needs. Could you please explain further, what do you mean by inverting the logics of development, learning from the poor and marginalized? Thank you.
And could I suggest maybe we also open this question up to the whole panel as well too? So Krithika, of course, take a moment and respond, but I think others on the panel also have insights on this question.
Totally, and I would someone else go first, so I get some time to think about it.
That's cheating.
She's honest about it.
So hi there. So having grown up actually very poor, I can just say I understand exactly where this question is coming from, right? And I think that I'm very suspicious of any kind of attempt to, quote unquote, protect the poor from the outside. Because that replicates a kind of humanitarianism that always ends in some kind of a disaster. I also want to tack on the reverse of that, which is to say, addressing the larger questions of vulnerability. Just to very quickly say that I think that the terms of disposability and killability might be a little easy for us, even killability, because what they really lie in is a colonial capitalist economy of infinite substitutability, in which the people that get killed are very much being able to be substituted as objects within colonial capital economies. And so I just want to raise that, I have a question about what is well-intentioned language that comes out of Judith Butler, but I don't buy it. And then the other thing I want to say in relation to the poverty question is we have to be careful not to think about poverty only in terms of the materials. So at the same time as I completely reject the notion of the idealization of poverty, I also want to raise the question of the fact that one of the reasons why we maintain isolation policies and so on, and gating and so on from the poor, is also a reason why we become more and more vulnerable. So if you're talking, this is why Esposito doesn't work out perfectly for me. If you're talking about, for example, who gets diseases where I work in rural South Africa, anybody who's had a really highly protected water system with chlorine is going to get sicker for much longer than I am, because I grew up in places where there wasn't a chlorine protected system. So I think we need to think a little bit more flexibly about the fact that though we think that we are privileged, one of the things that is hanging behind our refusal to degate or uncontaminate or whatever may be just somewhere deep down the knowledge that we are in some ways more vulnerable to some pathogens because we have been isolated. And so the idea that you're suggesting that we become animal is more threatening to those of us who are more privileged, even in a public health sense, before you even get to all of the other stuff. I hope that answered the question a little bit.
Robin, do you have any thoughts on this, or did you want to contribute?
I think, all the questions are very important. And for me, the central idea is the question of the other. For example, I read Nigel's article, what does it mean to be a pet? And we know that there are a lot of critics who are very suspicious about the idea of becoming animal, because there is always an anthropological apparatus that separates the human and the non-human. So here, for me, the idea is that we know there is a boundary. But if you think that theoretically there is no communication between the human and the animal, and I think this is a little bit bizarre. Why? Because you are thinking, this kind of mind-body dualism or inconscient idea. There is always a gap between phenomena and noumenon. In other words, you cannot understand the other. But we learn from indigenous studies. For example, human and the land, they are mutually implicated. But somehow, for some critics, they are very suspicious about this kind of intimacy because, again, this is about identification. And for me, there are three kinds of identification. Number one, imaginary identification. Number two, symbolic identification. Number three, the identification with the real. So, for example, for Zizek, he is very skeptical about, for him, this is a kind of ideology. So, but again, if you think things in terms of vulnerability, then I think the boundary can be loosened. It can be, we can try to use empathy to understand the other. Again, we know that we cannot enter the shoes of the other. In other words, we cannot understand the other. But again, we are all precarious. We are all vulnerable. And in this human condition, then we will try to think in terms of, we think from the viral eye, we think from the perspective of the animal, we think from the perspective of the other. So I think that this is a reversal of the anthropocentric perspective. In other words, this is, you can suspend, this is a suspension of our commonsensical, of our anthropocentric perspective. So for me, all the papers are very interesting because we tend to look at things in terms of an alternative perspective. I think this is what I'm thinking now. Thank you.
So to build on what Rosemary was saying, so that question in itself, I think in some ways does what I'm trying to avoid, which is to focus the gaze on the other, right? I'm sorry that I'm pointing to you, but because then that again shifts the onus. So it becomes about uplifting the poor or bringing them their material needs instead of redirecting the gaze on the privileged, which is what I think I've been arguing for, right? So in some ways, there is the question, I think, goes against the grain of what I was talking about. But on the other hand, if you think about just thinking about material needs, I come from Chennai, where water, access to drinking water has been a long-standing issue. But if there are, if poor people stand in queues for hours every day to get a bucket of water for their basic needs, it's not because there isn't enough water to go around, but it's because I have running tap water in my flat. And I don't swim, but my friends go swimming at the same time in the same city as where people are standing in long queues for drinking water. So there again, I would argue that it becomes way more important to redirect the gaze back onto ourselves and think about, so how can I learn to live with a bucket of water like perhaps the person who comes in to clean my mother's flat does? as opposed to thinking about how I can get her family access to as much water as my mother's family does. Do you get what? So that would be my kind of response to that.
Other questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you so much to all the panelists. My question is for Catherine. And I'm wondering, in terms of citizen science, it's relatively new. And as you pointed out, it can be exclusionary. However, it is also underfunded. And there are, the scientific community often questions its merits. And so citizen science often doesn't appear in publications. And its value in the contributions to the scientific community is often questioned. So I'm wondering, in terms of this e-butterfly initiative, and citizen science more broadly, what do you think the intention of citizen science should be? And I guess, could you respond to some of these problems of its underfunded nature and kind of its exclusion from the scientific community as contributing to some of these problems that you pointed out?
I think the goal of citizen science should be to rely on local indigenous knowledge rather than Western thought and Western modes of science. In regards to it being underfunded, I know specifically for eButterfly, it has significant amounts of funding. It has a huge data center in Ottawa. I think there's also, implications with what a citizen is. I don't know how to address the lack of funding. More research would have to be done to look at how to fix that. But to circle back to your first question, I think just the main goal of how to engage citizen science ethically and to work toward planetary health is to rely on ways of knowing that already existed before colonialism.
So I'm not addressing that question, and I need to be honest about this. I just want to point out that I'm a little uncomfortable with the notion that to say that everybody in a room is something is a really dangerous thing to do. Yeah, we have all ended up privileged. I bet you there are people here, though, who weren't raised that way. There's a porosity in the conventional world, not as much as we would want, but there is a porosity between people who grew up poor or this is not a proud thing or not a statement of an entitlement, but I did grow up on a bucket of water a day. So I just am really trying to point out that with our pedagogical strategies, we need to be very careful when we say we, what we're including or excluding. And that would, I've written about this in relation to talking about we as, for example, people who have not been sexually assaulted, because you often find that people are. I'm just trying to suggest that we attend to poverty in a way that doesn't assume that everybody has always lived in a way that this room and these attributes would suggest. Just a polite request. Thank you.
Point taken, thank you.
Oh, no, I wasn't directing it on me.
Someone ask a question and ease the tension. Not from your comment, from Krithika's feeling targeted. Does anyone have another question that they'd like to ask? Oh, I walked over here for that.
If you want something to ease the tension, Dr. Jolly, I was thinking you seem to have had a lot of fascinating life experiences and have traveled the globe. Do you have any interesting stories to take us into lunch with to, like you said, to ease the mood and the tension?
Okay, here's one. So I'm like, I don't know, 10 or 11, and I'm in the hospital that my parents worked in various ways. And we had people in and out of there all the time that were, some of them we could help, some we couldn't. We usually sent mental illness to the local Sangoma or the local healer, but sometimes they would be in our hospital area for about 3 days. And I remember saying to an outside visitor, we used to get, and I sort of have a kind of lingering bias against, Christian interventionism in poor areas, because we used to get a lot of them, even though it was a Anglican mission hospital, and they would, offer to do things and end up, messing up in various ways. Like you'd tell them, yes, we need a trench here, but for the love of God, don't dig here because this is where the main water line to the hospital is, and they would inevitably hit it, that kind of thing. And so we had one person who came up to visit and was interested in, quote unquote, what we were doing for the poor. And I warned him, I said, there is an adult man who's going to not look particularly coherent here because he isn't. He's a mental patient, but he's fine. He's not going to hurt you. So just to tell you that he's around, but just he's not a threat. And we had a 28-year-old young man from the UK who was working with us as a volunteer, an international voluntary service worker. And I took this man to visit my mother, who was in the administration office working on accounts. And the IVS man, Mark, who was 28 years old, was underneath fixing something with a battery that was running it was a public radio that we had for the emergency doctor services. And my mother, without thinking, said hello to this man who was visiting and said, "Don't worry about him, he's drinking battery acid." So you can imagine there was an automatic correlation between the quote-unquote madman and our IVS worker, who forever thereon afterwards became known as the madman in jokes. But it was also a little bit serious in that we never could dislodge from our international visitor the idea that this IVF worker was not the madman. It stuck with him no matter what we said. So we were kind of relieved when he left after 3 days. So that's my little story.
So with our last 5 minutes, I just want to turn it back to the panelists and see if they have any other additional thoughts or questions or comments to each other that they'd like to share as well.
Yeah, I was keen on hearing more about the fifth wave of public health. If you could speak a little more about that, if others want to.
Okay, so the fifth wave of public health starts with Glasgow. Now, Glasgow is a huge problem in public health because Glasgow has exactly the same history as poorer places in Edinburgh and surrounding Scottish cities. But it has very, very poor intergenerational outcomes in health in terms of substance abuse, smoking, socioeconomic determinants of health, as they are called, are very, very poor in that area. And so a group of public health professionals, including ethics folks, got together to try to figure out what is called the Glasgow effect. And one of the things that they realized was, for example, here's a very practical example. When you go to intervene in this high smoking stats of single mothers, in order to improve their health outcomes and outcomes for their children, it turns out that one of the few things that they can afford is, or they do afford themselves, is one cigarette every other day or every day or whatever, because it's their only break or relaxation from that. So when you attach that issue, it becomes very clear that the lives of single mothers, if you try to intervene in them, it's not about the ethical qualities of the mother or anything like that. It has to do with what in our business I call choice disablement. That is, that the range of choices that a normal public health model assumes, in which we can say to people, make good choices, Well, the good choices aren't there to begin with in that particular environment. These are people who come from intergenerational families of young reproduction, where if you speak to the grandmother or the grandmother before them, they will actually get very upset about young women who go out of the community in order to go and get an education because they're quote unquote betraying their family. So there's a valued sense of, you know, getting pregnant young, not married, staying within the realm of that particular motherhood. And I've actually met this in rural Pennsylvania as well, where I've had students whose parents are, you know, whose mothers have been upset that they got a scholarship to come to Penn State. Penn State doesn't have that many scholarships, so, you know, there are not many of them that come that way, from that kind of poverty. But at that stage, you begin to see that, you know, even what public health calls the ecological models of health can't deal with the massive damage of living in colonial capitalism and its values. And so it's at that point that Hanlon and everybody step in, and their big call at the end of the paper is like Nancy's Tuana's call, which is for that these solutions to these things have to be interdisciplinary. And I think that the key complication that they contribute in that key paper, that is, I think, in BMJ Public Health, but I'd have to check, is that the way that we live is itself the problem, and the medical issues that we throw up are the symptoms of how we're living. Whereas before we would look at the medical problems we throw up as the disease, it's actually the way we're living that are the disease. And the flip side of the coin of that is, of course, the indigenous diabetes issues in many indigenous communities that were referred to earlier by our Deninde correspondent. And I just want to point out that the other piece that gets left out is how privilege also results in negative health outcomes. And it's not often realized, but that's the flip side of the coin, especially in terms of mental health and other things, right? So even with somebody who is surviving well in a blue-collar job in rural Pennsylvania, their sense of worth might be such that it's easier for them to involve themselves in substance abuse practices because they know that there's no other way that they can live. Like, you can make enough money working at the local prison to raise a family, but is that something that is emotionally supportive and gives you a sense of worth, right? So those are the kinds of questions that Fifth Wave Public Health tries to. Did that help? Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool.
Thank you for those comments, Rose, and I think that's a great place for us to wrap up as we all go to lunch. And so please join me again in thanking all of our panelists.